I'm Paul Kerensa of the British Broadcasting Century podcast.
And I'm Harry White of the Modern British History podcast.
And you're listening to both of us at the same time in this collaboration. We're joining forces for one special episode to bring you a history of election night broadcasts, because at time of recording, we're about to have another one. It'll be our 28th in 102 years since British broadcasting began. And almost literally from day one, well, day two, broadcasting brought us the results live as they came in, first via radio and then later via television, swingometers, and of course, Dimblebees, at least two Dimblebees. There's been a swing to Dimblebees over the year. Absolutely.
Talking us through every election night special there's been, we have a special guest, author of the book Swing, A Brief History of British General Election Night Broadcasting. Buy it now, folks. It's Gary Rodger.
Hello. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. Lovely to be
Welcome.
here.
Lovely with Gary and Harry and Paul. What a combination, the three of us here for, well, we've got a lot to pack in. We've got about 40, 45 minutes of an episode, but 28 election night broadcasts to get through. Good luck,
So
everybody.
yeah, I think about my calculations might be off, but it's about 1 minute 11 seconds. We think we've got for each. So
Right. We better start, don't we? But do we begin with the very first election, or do we mention the US presidential election before it, 1920?
oh yeah, the prototype.
Yeah. So what
Definitely,
happened
let's
there
do
then?
it.
So all I know is there's election to begin with, pre-broadcasting. You had election via phonograph, campaign speeches distributed on records, in fact. But then, literally, as broadcasting began on KDKA Pittsburgh, 2nd November 1920, you get the election results, don't you? So first radio station broadcast in the world of any kind. It's 18 hours of coverage of KDKA Pittsburgh. The license came just days earlier, and the Pittsburgh Post newspaper got the results via phone as the listeners got the results as well. A revolutionary act as Warren G. Harding became president. But we don't care about that. It hasn't got American in the title of either of our podcasts, has it, Harry? So should we come to Britain?
Let's do it. Yeah, that's my stomping ground. So let's talk about some British elections.
All right. So, Gary, you're the author of the book. Would you like to introduce us to what happened on the 15th of November, 1922?
Yes, indeed. So the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, which was available in London and then on night number two in Manchester and Birmingham, they carried election results interspersed with, well, actually, I'm going to say election results interspersed with music. It's actually the other way around. The way it was billed was here's some music, and we will endeavor to provide you with some election results. And the this is of course the first time for most people that would have had a chance to be able to hear results with this kind of immediacy, because normally you'd either have to be at a count itself waiting for the dignitaries to go out to the balcony to deliver the result to the waiting crowd, or most people would be waiting for the next day's newspaper. And I think you've got a clip, is that right, of one Percy Edgar?
Yeah, Percy Edgar, station director of the Birmingham station, 5IT, who recalls what it was like on day two of the BBC, but day one of the BBC in Birmingham as those election results came in, which will play in. So there we go. Coming out of that clip then. But isn't it right, Garrett? I didn't know this, that actually the BBC actually had someone else as a competitor also giving out election results the same night.
This is actually true. Yes, I mean it was for a relatively select audience. Um, the Marconi company themselves had an agreement to send the White Star Line ships an election bulletin for passengers on board. So yeah, even then, if that was not quite enough niche for yourself, if you happen to live in Lincolnshire, specifically in the area of Newland, then you could go and stand outside the window of the Lincoln Wireless Company. They had an arrangement to receive the election results from 9:30 onwards and then announce them from a loudspeaker out of their window.
Wow, look at this. So this is Certainly on the British Broadcasting Century podcast, we've zoomed in a lot in the early 20s, and you can see the shape of broadcasting coming about. That things like loudspeakers in town centres, they tried that a little bit for the King's broadcast in 24, and village halls, you could gather and listen to radio live with your community in your little village hall. So it's an extension of that, I suppose. Yeah, still trying it all out, aren't they? But there you are.
Was there a sense, my competitive spirit wants to know, of who won that competition to be the broadcaster back then?
Well,
I'm gonna, I'm gonna say, unless you were, I'm not saying that the well-to-do would be the exclusive patrons of the White Star line ships, but I think for most people it would have been the by now, not so much fledgling, but by now, sort of because of the amount of publicity that it would have had in advance. Yeah, I think BBC. I mean, the Daily Mirror certainly was quite effusive. They said that broadcasting was an aid to the excitement of election night, so it had something of an immediate impact.
I've been reading a bit as well. Before that, 1920 to 1922, the Marconi Company, as we know, sort of almost gave birth to the BBC in a way. But there was this in World War One, actually, even earlier than that, then 1960, 1970, 1980, the Marconi Company was sending out news to ships at sea, and that was thought of as a possibility to sort of before broadcasting happened that it might catch on, that they could actually just keep on sending out news bulletins to ships. So the Marconi Company, even back then, was sometimes in competition with themselves as they were developing new technology, still sending out news bulletins, but also developing this new broadcasting thing. So you have this oddity there. But we've loitered far too long on election result number one, haven't we? Should we crash on to election result number two, which was only a year later, 1920, a lot of elections.
Yes, indeed. So on 6th of December 1923, this was Ramsay MacDonald ultimately becoming Prime Minister, minority Labour government with sort of tacit support from the Liberals. Now, by this point, the BBC, still the British Broadcasting Company, even by this point, they had expanded far and wide. So they're now available in Aberdeen, in Birmingham, in Bournemouth, in Cardiff, in Glasgow, Manchester, Newcastle, and Sheffield. Very similar to the previous year. Again, the music from the Savoy Hotel was taking precedence, and yes, every once in a while, you'd have a selection of election results to hear.
And I should say up front, I have a feeling we'll be hearing a little more from me in the early part of this podcast, and then not much of me at all in the second half of the podcast, as my awareness goes away after the 1920s. But simultaneous broadcasting was a big thing that year. That summer that came in, so that's like networking, sending out the same broadcast from one station to others via landlines. So for big moments, they did it for news and they did it for the occasional concert. So a thing like an election was a great use of that, I suppose. And another election a year later, 1924.
Yes, indeed. The return of Stanley Baldwin. And as you'd mentioned yourself, this was the first election that would have party political broadcasts to an extent. Each leader of the three main parties had 20 minutes each on the radio. By this point, you could hear the BBC in Belfast, in Edinburgh, in Hull, Leeds and Bradford, Liverpool, Nottingham, Plymouth, and Stoke-on-Trent.
I'm not an expert in this. Harry might know more than me about this stuff because I'm not that political. But I've heard it said that Stanley Baldwin was like the first solid radio politician that he had a way of just conversing with the people. But and that it was almost I've heard it more that it was I think in the same way that in America you have the Al Jolson thing of you boomed very loudly to the back of the balcony. But the Bing Crosby thing was using the microphone to actually kind of almost whisper and speak up close and use nuance and stuff. That Stanley Baldwin was doing that was actually saying, look, you and me, electorate, we're above all of this, infighting and stuff. Whereas his competitors were a bit more the town hall style, I guess.
That's very interesting. I do think there's something about creating a certain sense of intimacy, isn't there? I mean, there's the fireside chats that presidents have used. I don't know in terms of Stanley Baldwin as much. The main thing I know about Stanley Baldwin is Liz Truss apparently compared herself to Stanley Baldwin. Take that as you will.
Okay, so Stanley Baldwin, the Liz Truss of the 1920s. But the 1929, then, this is our fourth British broadcast election result, and I think it's quite a big one. We had a few in a row: 22, 23, 24. 5 years later, we've got equal franchise. Men and women can vote if you're over 21. And this is also under the new British Broadcasting Corporation. So they've got a more solid footing in society, but working out that actually you don't want to upset the government too much. Don't want controversial broadcasts.
Yeah, this is a big one because we've got a handful of quite significant elements to this one. So, first of all, there was by now an agreement with the newspapers because they were concerned about the BBC taking away their readership. So, even though radio was on until 4 a.m. on this occasion with the results service. From that point onwards, there was no more radio news until 6 p.m. on the following day. So that was effectively preserving the newspaper's, little window of opportunity to capture the public's attention. We've also got quite an interesting little aside here. The station 5GB Daventry, which is an experimental station for the Midlands, they broadcast at 9 p.m. the very first instance of a post-poll satirical election program, which is called Voteville. It was a baritone by the name of Alfred Butler, who was a regular performer on the station and supporting cast. And this, of course, was timed for, when the polls had closed. The polls closed at 8 o'clock at that time, but the parties could request an extension if they so wished in any given constituency. So 9 p.m., nice and safe. It was close as they could get to it. Yes, of course, now this is an established practice these days, having the sort of the post 10 p.m. sort of comic relief. Okay, right now we can say what we've not been allowed to say for the past 6 weeks and so on. And of course, we've also got rather unusual instance in this case. I don't think we're going to see a repeat of this in 2024, but on the night itself, there were complaints from listeners who had previously been told in the Radio Times, please do not telephone us and ask us for the results because we can't give them out, which was a common, notice in the newspapers at that time. People ringing up the local paper and saying, have we got the result from, my constituency yet? But in response to listeners' telephone complaints of perceived bias from the on-air announcers, Sir John Reef decided to interrupt proceedings and inform the newscasters that he himself would take over the task of reading the results on the air. And one of the announcers, a chap called Eric Dunstan, he informed the Guardian that upon Director General Reef taking up the microphone, the telephone started ringing, listeners asking that the announcements should be clearer and slower. Dunstan relayed this information to Reef, who refused to alter his delivery and continued as before. Dunstan then left the BBC studio at Savoy Hill and went on to an election night party where he, quotation, talked perhaps indiscreetly of my dispute, with the result that my resignation is prematurely recorded in today's press. We can only presume if beverages were available at this election night party, but yes.
So, and Reith then at this point, he'd announced the end of the general strike a couple of years earlier, and it seemed he had this rather grand opinion of himself, as we know, to the degree that he thought he should be the one to announce these things on the air. It's what the people wanted, and as you say, they had those people phoning up, and they even had phone calls, I believe, saying they couldn't quite understand everything that Reith was saying, a little rushed and unclear. But there we are.
Always a scary moment when your boss steps in and says, "Do you know what? I think I'm going to take this one on."
I'm just imagining the storm on Twitter if in 2024 the DG just walked in and said to James Knockley, right, okay, I can take it from here, right, okay, where's the microphone?
Well, it's true with no Hugh Edwards this time. Tim Davie could have taken it over. This could have been the chance, but I believe we've got Clive Myrie instead. But there we are. And then so it flows over into 1931. Then the next election after that, when they actually stated in the Radio Times, please do not ring up the BBC during the election broadcast, because there were so many the previous time, it seemed, that listeners needed to be told they are busy, they cannot take your call while they are on air doing the election results. It's a manic time.
Yes, it was quite a common notice in the newspapers, but this was the first occasion in which that notice appeared in the ever popular Radio Times.
Okay then. Anything? No, I go a little bit quiet on the next couple. 1935, Baldwin, and then it's the wartime coalition. That's the last election for 10 years, isn't it?
Yes. So one noticeable aspect about this one, of course, nobody knew at the time that this was going to be our last election for a decade or so, but Will Hay made a surprise appearance at this time. He was appearing on his Saturday evening variety show, and it was curtailed before it was due to finish. The BBC's director of variety explained in an official letter of apology it was necessary for the 10 p.m. news to start on time. Because this was going to be followed by one of the campaign's party election broadcasts. In this case, it was going to be funded by Neville Chamberlain. It was important for that to take place on schedule, as the corporation wished to offer its listeners the opportunity at the conclusion of that broadcast to hear a talk by Sir Samuel Hoare live from Switzerland. And that couldn't be delayed because not only was a telephone line to Geneva booked, but also Sir Samuel had a train to catch afterwards.
Vital, these things.
But Will Hay did accept the BBC's apology and said, we are friends again.
Oh, very good. Very good.
I know we're short on time, Gary. Very quick question, which probably has a very long answer, but if there's a shorter answer, this is a time, the 30s, where Germany and particularly Hitler himself was pioneering techniques in radio in a very malignant way. And I wondered if there was any kind of looking across going on from Britain to what was happening in Germany in terms of kind of new media strategies.
It's not really an area that I've got any particular expertise in, unfortunately. The only thing I could probably add to that would be that the BBC by this point was certainly very image conscious, and I thought there was not going to be too much longer before this point where we have the instance of the newsreader introducing themselves. You know, this is the BBC News and this is John Snagg reading it, for example, in order to make clear to their listeners that the information that they were getting was trustworthy.
I know we had an episode on the podcast of the British Broadcasting Century about radio propaganda in World War II, and you could see the certain elements that were on all sides of the war, really. You know, those things of trying to undermine, you know, each country by dropping in fake news reports about pay rises in German factories that weren't existing, but just to make the other factories go on strike and the like. So nefarious means in terms of their broadcasting sometimes. But there's now this is the 6th election night special, but it's the final radio only election night special, I believe. Could you unpack that for us? Why is that particularly, what does it change in 45?
Yes, so the election in 1945 with the Attlee Labour landslide, that was on the 5th of July. But of course, there were still many people from the UK who were still serving overseas. So the counting was 3 weeks after polling day. And so in that instance, then there was no necessity for any kind of overnight count. So the results came in during the day. And instead of clearing the schedules, as they would normally have done for a nighttime programme, the BBC decided that they would stick largely with their existing pattern. So they had shows such as Workers' Playtime, Music While You Work, and Children's Hour, and then interspersed with that were the results as they gradually came in. Now, this wasn't entirely welcome, this decision. The Daily Worker, the precursor to the Morning Star, published a leader in which it argued what could be of greater importance on this one day in 10 years and for every elector to have the opportunity to hear as many results as possible. The BBC, in response, maintained that an all-day election programme was not practicable in view of the publication of all the results on the same day. And as you hinted at there, of course, that was the last radio-only election.
Harry, so 1945, who wins then? What's the political landscape looking like at this stage?
So I mean, it was very much expected that Winston Churchill would win in terms of, you know, the man who was pivotal in winning the Second World War, and quite a surprise that Attlee, who's considered quite a mild-mannered person, won. But there was a sense in the country broadly that Churchill had won the war, but it was Labour who would win the peace essentially and build the new Britain, the new Jerusalem, as Attlee said. And you had huge policies announced, probably most memorably the birth of the NHS and the welfare state.
Right, yeah, of course. Yeah, so we're post-war, and then the changes come thick and fast. We get an NHS, and then in 1950, television has arrived in the 30s. But in terms of this, for various reasons, then the fact there was no election for a decade, we suddenly get a TV election night special.
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, we'll keep this concise because we could do obviously an entire podcast about 1950 by itself,
We will
but
separately.
so obviously a lot of this is at the suggestion, behest, that just the overall energy, the force of nature that was Grace Wyndham Goldie, who was part of BBC News. Television Talks was one such department of the BBC that she was in charge of. If you happen to live in London or the Midlands and you had the television service, then you could have switched on election night and you would have seen somewhat topical from the time that we're recording this, a former D-Day reporter, a chap called Chester Wilmot, was the host. And Grace Wyndham Goldie's main argument was that television itself should be a medium for the discussion of news and current affairs and should be utilized in a way that radio could not. So, for example, on the radio, an entire result, party, name, number of votes, repeat as necessary, majority, turnout, so and so on. You have to read every single line of that. Whereas on television, you can have a caption with the key points emphasized, and instantly you're able to convey all of that information and also the key point that the viewer is interested in. And the caption cards at this time were written, they were painted onto cards. That took about 45 seconds or so. And that allowed the team of psephologists, one of whom, of course, was the late great David Butler. I'll say that again because I just hit me a little box there. One of whom was the late great David Butler. And that allowed them the time for them to interpret that information because David Butler had pioneered the idea of swing in British elections. This argument basically that the UK, at least at that time, tended to vote in a relatively uniform manner. So from a handful of results in constituencies such as, say, Guildford or Billericay or whatever it might be, swing constituencies, you could then extrapolate what the likely outcome of the entire election was going to be. That famous phrase, which I think probably most people associate with Monty Python these days more than anything else, that the whole country behaves like that. Then, we are looking at Conservative government, Labour government, whatever it might be. And at that time, of course, still black and white television for best part of 20 years. So there was a system of white, black, and white diagonal stripe for Liberal to indicate to the viewers on the board, the back of the set, what was happening. Richard Dimbleby was out on location, and he was reporting at Trafalgar Square, where, of course, they had a big screen. Crowds would turn out for election night at that time. And Grace Wyndham Goldie herself said that there was something quite democratic about the politicians watching the results come in at the same time as the rest of the general public. And I think you also had a clip here of Tony Benn. Is that right?
Maybe so. Let's find out in the edit. And if we don't, then that will go. So, and this is also the first election results with since the 1947 Committee on Party Political Broadcast, I believe, that allocated the number to each party. So they're trying to do that thing that we sort of see nowadays. It's kind of a little tiresome, maybe an election build-up of balance that we see, especially on television, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned now swing was a big thing you mentioned there, of course, which we'll come back to with the swingometer that comes in before long. But we should whiz past as well. So 1951, Churchill again. I thought he was history, but no, he's back with us.
Yes, indeed.
No, Churchill made a return. I mean, Churchill, at this point, many people were thinking in his own party that Churchill should resign, but there was a feeling of it's very hard to tell someone who's won the Second World War it's time to go. So many people in his cabinet were thinking, oh, the old man, it's kind of reached that point. But there was a reluctance to tell him. And in fact, Churchill kept having health issues. I believe it was kept having strokes and still, in very Churchillian fashion, carried on being prime minister.
And this then, 1951, is the first televised party political broadcast, I think, is that right, of Lord Samuel of the Liberal Party, which wasn't good from what I gather, rather scripted and sounded it, forgetting it was television and that you could be seen. So television's come along, but they didn't instantly know how best to use television, I imagine.
Yeah, you mentioned there, but the first one being the Liberal Party. The following night was the Conservatives, and then followed by Labour. That Conservative broadcast is frequently, I would say, there's a clip of that which is frequently misused in modern day documentaries, because Anthony Eden is interviewed by Leslie Mitchell, famous BBC wartime reporter, host, later associated with the early days of ITV as well. And Mitchell is basically asking Eden, what would you like to speak about? Would you like to speak about home affairs? Would you like to speak about foreign affairs? Whatever, whichever you prefer. And this is quite often cited as an example of deferential interviewing in television news. Now, it's certainly the case that at this time, yes, television news interviewing is quite deferential, but it's misleading to use that particular clip because that is a party political broadcast. It's not actually a news report.
And you also get then at this one outside broadcasts from some actual counts for the first time. Only 3 of them, I believe, and Salford West was the first of those, making Salford West the first televised declaration of an electoral win. Charles Royal of the Labour Party. So there you go, history in the making.
Indeed.
So we have as well Richard Dimbleby on location. That was something he particularly got going even before the Second World War, this sort of on location reporting where it happens, making these things happen.
The Salford Corporation Parks Department was ready for Dimbleby's arrival because they erected temporary guardrails to protect their flower beds from damage by the expected crowd, because as soon as the crowd realized that Dimbleby was going to be there, they were of course going to try and get on the TV and try and get an interview from himself. I don't think they used the expression necessarily vox pops at that time, but as it turned out, that declaration came so early at 21 minutes past 10, so only 6 minutes after the BBC had started the programme, there were no such interviews. So Salford Corporation's practices were not required on this occasion.
The 10th.
And Gary, had the drama of the election started to be televised? Of when I think of elections now, you often think of the running about with ballot boxes and doing the count. Had that sunk in by this time, or was that rhythm still to come?
Now, sadly, we don't have any footage in existence from this or 1950, but it is something that you spot as early as our first surviving election, 1955, which we're coming on to, where, yes, to an extent, Richard Dimbleby acknowledges the existence of this horse race, as some people put it, between the constituencies which are vying to be first. Although he does add as a caveat that this is somewhat disputed by the constituencies at that time, because they felt that not only was that slightly trivializing things, but they certainly didn't want to give the impression that they were racing through the count and potentially miscounting in order to then be the first one to declare. It's a bit more obvious now, certainly, but in those early days, Yes, there was certainly competition between the constituencies, but it was somewhat downplayed by all involved.
And that 1955 one, it's the last BBC solo one before ITV comes along. And it's huge because you get the swingometer. David Butler, as you said, gives us that. And that sense of using the visual, because you know you've got Bob Early as well, aka Mr. Gadget or whatever, with the 600 table tennis balls creating this constituency map. So before CGI, you get all this stuff, including that magical swingometer.
Yes, and yeah, this is the earliest one that we still have a recording of. You can see it right now. It's on the iPlayer. There's 3 hours of material which survives out of 17 hours. Richard Dimbleby was the anchor for the first time. And as you mentioned, this is our first appearance, obviously, of the swingometer, although it's not at this point a pivotal part of the operation and isn't coming from the main studio. It was a presenter from BBC South who was using it to, or I beg your pardon, BBC West at that time, because BBC South didn't exist at that time until later. So a reporter from BBC West who was trying to explain the swing in the 2 Southampton constituencies, and he displayed this pendulum device. David Butler then saw this and recommended that this was adopted for the national coverage, and then, of course, became an established part of the setup from 59.
So it's hand operated, just a small chart, a nail, and a wooden arrow to begin with, and from there,
Yeah,
things.
and would remain hand operated all the way through to Robert Mackenzie's final election, 1979. It was not until Peter Snow with the all new swingometer in '92 that it would be fully electronic.
Well, we better swing on, so to speak, from there because look at the time. So 1959 is the first proper swingometer, then potentially in after the regional use, and then we go on through from there. Whisk us through some of those next ones in bullet point form, if you may.
Sure. So 1959 is the first time that the BBC has television competition, of course, because independent television news had arrived in 55. And one significant aspect of this election was that shortly before 1 a.m., the Labour leader, Hugh Gaitskell, was ready to concede the election quite early in the evening. And he did so whilst he was live on ITV's programme. He was speaking to an ITN reporter called Neville Clark. And this was the first such occasion in which a party leader conceded in this manner. And it was not universally popular, I should say, not universally popular. It was seen as a sort of American habit, so to speak, in presidential elections. But nevertheless, yeah, that gave ITV a scoop in an election which otherwise the BBC fairly comfortably won in terms of their output and the viewership. 64 was Richard Dimbleby's final election. It was also David Dimbleby's first.
Oh, yes, sorry.
As,
Yes. Apologies. I got my Dimblebys confused. You're right. Sorry. Richard Dad,
yes.
David's son. Got it.
Yes. So David Dimbleby's first as an outside broadcast reporter. I think it was Exeter, he was. And bizarrely, Steptoe's son made an appearance in this campaign because that was being repeated at the time at 8 p.m. Harold Wilson asked the BBC if they wouldn't mind nudging it till after the polls closed because he was worried about the impact that it would have on people, because of course Labour voters tended to vote later in the day following their work, and the BBC acquiesced and nudged Steptoe to 9 o'clock that night. ITN also introduced the permanent seat counter on the screen in this year, 1964, which is the first time that you had the vote or the seat tally on the screen at all times. 66, not 70, 66 was the first colour television coverage in the UK, although that's, of course, entirely misleading because if you were in the UK, you couldn't see it. Unless you happened to be a reporter for The Observer, in which case you might have been given access to the special production area and television centre, Studio 7, and you were able to see the output from ABC and NBC in America who were covering the British election using colour cameras, one of which was imported from Holland. And then 1970, with the enormous BBC set, and this one is hugely significant because this was the one that gave us the very first exit poll. The BBC and Nuffield College identified Gravesend as the UK's most typical constituency, and the shock result of their exit poll was that the Conservatives were slightly in the lead, and this turned out to be spot on the night.
I've heard it said that 1970s, when Harold Wilson started doing the walkabouts, that he sort of copied from the Queen as well. So in that, again, thing of using TV visual news and the like, and then also sense in the 60s and by then being influenced by American television, although it wasn't, television wasn't anything new, but actually suddenly people started paying more attention because the JFK versus Nixon one was quite exciting televisually. So suddenly people getting a bit more gripped by election night specials, potentially speaking.
An image so important. Harold Wilson actually preferred smoking cigars to pipes, but would smoke a pipe on TV to give that sense of a Labour politician. So it shows you the power of TV.
We're barely halfway through with a minute left of the Zoom call. So how are we going to do this? We rattle through in 30 seconds. We might have to rejoin another time, but maybe it's just part one. Who knows? But 1974, two elections. We can rattle through those very quickly, can't we?
Yeah, two elections in 74. The first one producing a minority Labour government, and the second with a Labour majority of three. In this case, Alistair Burnett had been the ITN anchor from 64. He swapped sides. He was on BBC during this time. And certainly the first one, the first election of 74, was all the way through, not non-stop, but it was all the way through to Monday, 6:30, when we actually saw the new Prime Minister enter Downing Street.
We've got to have